The training hall of the Galactic Coalition Academy smelled like burnt ozone and fear, mostly the cadets' fear, though none of them would admit it. Instructor Kale Veyron paced the length of the combat floor with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who had never once been challenged. He was Velhari, a species that had dominated interstellar combat training for 3 centuries. 7 feet of layered muscle wrapped in pale blue exoskeleton, 4 upper limbs that could strike in any direction simultaneously, and reflexes so fast that most species classified him as a natural disaster rather than a person. He had trained warriors from 42 species. He had never trained a human before. The 18 cadets arranged before him represented the best of the Coalition's intake class, Theran Scouts, Orvaki sharpshooters, 2 Kasari twins who shared a combat-link neural bond. At the very end of the line, almost unremarkable, stood Cadet Mara Ellison. Human. Female. 23 years old. From a planet called Earth, which Kale had looked up exactly once and immediately categorized under Death World, Extreme Hostility Index 9.4. He hadn't looked it up again. He didn't think he'd needed to. Today, Kale announced, his translator chip rendering his voice into flat, clean standard galactic, we demonstrate the fundamental principle of coalition combat doctrine. Threat assessment. You will face a superior opponent. You will identify your weaknesses. You will surrender gracefully and live to fight another day. He let his 4 eyes sweep the line. I will attack each of you. Your task is not to win. It is to survive 30 seconds. The Theran cadet went first. He lasted 19 seconds before Kale had him pinned against the mat with 2 limbs to spare. The Kasari twins went together, cheating, technically, but Kale allowed it. They coordinated beautifully. They lasted 26 seconds. One by one, cadets crumpled, surrendered, or were gently deposited onto the floor in ways that left their dignity mostly intact. When Kale reached the end of the line, he paused. Mara Ellison looked back at him with eyes the color of old copper, calm, assessing, almost bored. She was small by any species standard. The top of her head reached his 3rd shoulder joint. She had no exoskeleton, no venom glands, no secondary musculature. Her bones, according to the intake file, were calcium-based and rated brittle by Velhari standards. She looked, in his professional estimation, like prey. Cadet Ellison, he said. Your objective is the same. Survive 30 seconds. Understood, instructor. Her voice was quiet. Steady. Too steady. Kale noted it the way an experienced predator notes when something small doesn't run, with the faintest flicker of attention. Then he dismissed it. He had seen bravado before. It never lasted past the first strike. He moved. He was fast, faster than most recording equipment could properly capture, faster than most nervous systems could process. His lead limb shot out in a controlled strike aimed at her shoulder, the kind of move designed to spin a smaller opponent off balance without causing injury. Mara wasn't there. He blinked, all 4 eyes, a rare involuntary response. She had stepped into the strike. Not away from it. Into it. She'd let his limb pass within a centimeter of her ear, used the momentum of his swing to rotate under his reach, and now she was inside his guard, that impossible, dangerous space that no sane opponent ever tried to occupy because his remaining 3 limbs could crush anything standing there. She drove her elbow into the joint between his 2nd and 3rd arm. It didn't hurt. Of course it didn't hurt, she was human, her impact force was laughable by Velhari scale. But his arm folded in a direction it wasn't supposed to fold, and for 0.4 seconds his stance shifted. 0.4 seconds was apparently enough for Mara Ellison. She hooked her ankle behind his forward leg, his load-bearing leg, the one he always kept planted, and pulled. Kale Veyron, 3-century veteran of coalition combat training, decorated instructor, ranked 7th among all active Velhari warriors, went down on one knee. The training hall went absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of cadets trying not to react. The paralyzed silence of people whose brains had stopped processing correctly because reality had glitched. Cale recovered in under a second. He was back on his feet, all four arms moving, recalculating, and now he wasn't demonstrating anymore. Some older, honest part of his neurology had quietly stepped forward and said, "This organism is a threat." He came at her again, this time without restraint. She ran. Not away, sideways, a diagonal, cutting across his angle of approach, so he had to redirect, which cost him a fraction of his momentum. She vaulted off the equipment rack mounted on the wall, used the wall as a third surface, came down behind him and hit him across the back of his primary neck joint with the heel of her palm. Again, impact force, negligible. But she'd found the nerve cluster. Every Velhari had one. It was listed in their species medical file as theoretical vulnerability, force threshold too high for most species to exploit. Mara Ellison, apparently, had read the medical file. His vision flickered for 0.3 seconds. She was already moving again. He spun, all four arms sweeping in a cage formation, the move that had ended every fight he'd been in for the last 40 years. There was no way through it. There was no way around it. Physics didn't allow for it. Mara went under it. She hit the floor in a dead drop, rolled, came up between his legs, the one place his arms literally could not reach, grabbed his forward leg with both hands, and pulled with everything she had. He didn't fall. Her strength wasn't enough for that. But she made him step back. Twice. And then the timer on the wall chimed. 30 seconds. Mara Ellison stood up, brushed the dust off her training uniform, and returned to her position in line. Her breathing was slightly elevated. There was a small cut on her cheek from where she'd rolled across the mat too fast. Otherwise she looked exactly the same as when the exercise had started. The rest of the cadets stared at her. Cale stared at her. He became aware, slowly, that his secondary hearts were beating faster than they should be. He became aware that he was running a rapid threat reassessment on an organism he had dismissed 60 seconds ago as non-threatening. He became aware that he had been, in the old Velhari military term, embarrassed by something soft. "Cadet Ellison," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "Explain your methodology." She tilted her head slightly. "You had a reach advantage of approximately 2 meters across all four limbs. A strength advantage of," she paused, calculating, "probably 12 to 1. Speed advantage of about 3 to 1 on initial strike. Trying to match you on any of those vectors would have been statistically pointless. So I didn't. I used your reach against your recovery time. I targeted joint angles instead of trying to overpower the joints. I read the species file on Velhari nerve clusters during orientation week." A small pause. "And I watched how you moved during the first 17 assessments and noted that you always load your weight onto your forward leg before a full arm sweep." Silence. "You watched the other assessments," Cale repeated slowly, "and identified a pattern in my attack sequencing." "Yes, instructor. In 17 assessments." "You're very consistent," she said, and it was not quite a compliment and not quite an insult and somehow was both at once. Cale looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the planet Earth, with its death world classification and its 9.4 hostility index. He thought about a species that had evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them at all times, a species that had never been able to rely on strength or speed or armor, a species that had survived entirely on information, adaptation, and the deeply unsettling willingness to walk into danger and find the angle. He thought about the fact that Mara Ellison had spent 17 assessments not nervously waiting her turn, but studying him. He made a decision. "Change of curriculum," he announced to the hall. The other cadets startled out of their stunned silence. "Cadet Ellison will run the remainder of today's session. She will assess each of you and identify the structural weaknesses in your technique." He looked at her directly. She has just demonstrated the only skill that actually wins wars. Mara blinked, the first genuinely surprised expression she'd shown. Instructor? Not strength, Kale said. Not speed. He glanced down at the faint scuff marks on the floor where he'd been forced backward 2 steps by someone a fraction of his size. Information. The willingness to look at something bigger than you, understand it completely, and then dismantle it on your own terms. He stepped aside. The floor is yours, cadet. Mara Ellison looked at the line of cadets, Theron, Kasari, or Vaki, every species the galaxy had decided was more impressive than a soft, fragile, calcium-boned human girl from a rock that wanted them dead. She smiled. It was not a particularly comforting smile. All right, she said. Everyone back on the mat. Let's start with what you're doing wrong. Later, in his private log, Instructor Kale Veyron added a single line beneath the heading Human, Death World Species, Threat Assessment. Do not let them study you first.